All right, welcome back to Technado. We have a very special guest today joining us. We have Jack Rhysider, who is the host and creator of Darknet Diaries. Very cool podcast for those of you that have heard it, or if you haven't, we'll find out a lot about it today. So, Jack, how you doing?
Great. Oh, wow. Thanks for having me here. This is awesome.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And for those that are watching the video now, you'll see that is not necessarily Jack. It could be. We have an artist rendering of what we believe Jack to look like, but
this is like Bigfoot
from witness accounts. Exactly like Bigfoot. But yeah, you like to keep your anonymity, which I completely understand as a security professional. And is that just to kind of keep the persona up, or are you worried about like retribution from the people you're exposing on the dark?
Yeah, a little bit of everything, right? I am a privacy fanatic, so I want to make sure that I'm doing best practices myself. And in the past, I have had someone, some YouTube videos I've uploaded like over a decade ago. Somebody tracked me to where I work using that OSINT and stuff like that. So the kind of triangulation based on some of the features in the background and trees and buildings, and they figured out like where I was, and then they looked up all kinds of extra stuff. So I have kind of been freaked out before by having my face on the internet, so I kind of just do a little bit of a shroud there and see how it goes.
So you're telling me all the paranoia that I thought was a little overblown is actually valid?
Yeah, it very is valid. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I feel better about myself.
If that happened to me, I'd be like, I'm scared, I'm upset with you, but I'm also very impressed, just based on that reason.
No, there's no impressed.
While you were being stabbed, you would think, like, I'm so flattered by this moment here.
To be stabbed by this guy.
Who are you again?
So for those that have not heard the podcast before, how would you describe it? It's like a true crime, it's kind of like, yeah.
It has a little bit of, it has feet in all kinds of different things. It's a bit educational, a bit newsy, a bit storytelling, a bit true crime. Basically, I was really inspired by podcasts like This American Life and Radiolab, and wanted a show that just does hacker stories, or people have been hacked or have done a hack or some kind of been infected by one. And I was like, these are such great stories. They're high drama, sometimes the FBI is involved and that kind of thing. So I couldn't find a show that was doing that. So I made one for myself just so I could listen to it, right? And other people like it too. So yeah, I sometimes interview hackers or people who have been affected by a breach or something. And then, it's in a kind of a storytelling mode as well. So there's a little music behind it and stuff like that. And it's really fun.
So was there one specific story that led you to say, oh, I've got to go out and tell this story. It's finally time to do this podcast? Or is this something you've just been working up to for a while?
Yeah, I think it was the shell shock or something like that, where like 4 years after the fact, I had learned about so much other stuff that came out, like OpenSSH forked into like LibreSSH, with then fixed a bunch of bugs, which then merged back into OpenSSH, and then OpenSSH got like $400,000 worth of extra funding from different businesses. And I'm like, where were the news cycles telling me all this? I had no idea if OpenSSH was still a problem, and it looks like it had a lot of help after this breach. So I really wanted someone to give me a story from beginning to end. Okay, here's who the hacker was, why they got in, what the bug was, the exploit, all this stuff that went through and knocked over something, and then what was the result and the end, damages done, and did anyone get arrested, and then what, let's wrap it all up in a bow, because our current, InfoSec news is kind of like, if you miss a couple days, then you might be behind and not know what's going on. So I kind of am a slow news junkie, where I want to wait until everything is done before then I start putting it all together and seeing what the story is.
That's something I was really curious about, is when a breach happens, companies have actually gotten a lot better about notifying us pretty quick, right? That, hey, a breach occurred. But details either take a long time to come out or don't come out at all. And so there's a lot of times where you hear about a huge breach like the Equifax breach, and it takes months before you get a hint on what happened, or, it can even just never occur. Years later, you look back and you're like, well, how did that breach occur? So how are you able to find that? Are you just like digging through all the various news sources, or are you starting, like, have you gained enough popularity now where you're actually getting feedback from insiders?
Well, yeah, one of the tricks I have is Google Alerts. So I have, such one is hacker sentenced. Now, if you see a news article that says this hacker was sentenced to 5 years in jail or something, well, now I have the whole story, right? I know who the hacker was, how they got arrested, what they did, who they hit, all these things. And now the final result, the verdict of, okay, well, they hit and they landed 5 years in jail. So now we can rewind. And oftentimes when I hear hacker sentenced, I've never even heard of that whole story, right? So when Google Alerts usually brings me something I've never even heard of, and it's really fascinating to then go back and say, okay, what did this guy do, and what were all the problems? So that's one big thing. And yeah, people respect the show enough that they're like, hey, I'll tell you my story, and I'm getting some very interesting stuff come to me.
Do you have difficulty getting these people to speak about it, because you're actually doing interviews with the people involved with these cases? Do you have a lot of stories that you've wanted to tell but maybe can't get people to agree to come on?
Oh yeah, definitely. The number of shoulder taps I've done and weird looks I've gotten, like, yeah, dude, like, I'll tell you my story, sure, and just like kind of laugh at me. That's just an infinite amount of those. So that happens, and I just keep tapping on shoulders, and eventually I get somebody who's like, yeah, I definitely will talk to you about it. And
So
so
this
it's a numbers game there. But when I talk to them, oftentimes I'm bringing up like the worst part of their history, like the hardest time of their life. And at first I used to feel bad asking them to like, tell me about that time you were, raided by the FBI, and how, and what your parents thought of you at that point, like it's hard, but at the same time, nobody may have ever sat down with that person and listened to the whole story. And so it is cathartic to a lot of these people to just, let's do the whole story, and it's all about you, and let's get it off your chest and hear everything. And there were times that were, depression was a big serious
so
thing.
you're
Let's talk about that for a while. So I think people do like saying our story at the end.
sorry. So you're putting these out about every 2 weeks, it looks like. So how many of these do you actually have kind of in the hopper that you're working on at one given time? Because these are really well put together, journalistic pieces, a lot of investigation going on. So do you have a lot of different ones that you're working on, and just when one wraps up, you're able to release that?
Yeah, I think at this point I'm working on like 10 at a time. So I'll get an interview whenever I can, and then just get that saved, and then work on, like rearrange it to when I think I might want to put that in the feed, and then start working on it when the time comes. So I've got a lot of interviews already completed, and then I'm working with some people who are interested in sharing a story, but I haven't yet interviewed them. So yeah, probably about 10. And then I'm also fostering a lot of relationships, just not quite asking people to talk, but then, getting them, to familiar with me and understand who I am. So there's a lot of stuff always going on at once.
So how do you decide like when an episode is done, like when it's ready to be released? Because I feel like with a lot of the stuff that you could constantly continue just digging and digging and find out more and more details. So eventually there reaches a point where, you feel there's enough information to go ahead and release. Do you have like a set of rules you follow, or it's just you feel like it's ready?
Yeah, I mean, so when I first started doing this, I tried to learn how to be a storyteller, and there's a lot of resources out there. So like for one, uh, what is that? Khan Academy has combined with Pixar to create a whole course on storytelling, and it's just great. Like it tells you about character development and story arc and twists and turns and what needs to be done. So if I can look at a hacking story and see that there's enough meat in there and length and stuff, and it has twists and turns, and there's a whole arc that kind of resolves, that we might have stories where we don't know who the hacker was at the end, and so those are unresolved, but still there's enough to say that a story has had its full arc. Then that's when I think that it's worthy for the show. And then if I can then get all the pieces together where I write it and get whatever interviews I can and stuff, and then I'll listen to it probably 10 times before I do publish it too, to just make it better and better. And eventually I'm just done with working on that episode because I put so much effort into it, and I'm just like, I can't do it anymore. It's just ready to go.
Have you had any where you've gone back like afterwards as a follow-up, or you learned some new detail that you really felt you had to address?
Yeah, for sure. There's a few that I don't quite get right. I have what I guess a typo of the mouth where I say the wrong thing, and I do go back and I fix it. And and then a couple times there have been follow-ups where a hacker was sentenced, because maybe I just caught the story when the hacker was arrested, but not quite sentenced. So I'm like, hey, I'll go back and say what the sentence was. So I do add every now and then a few extra things just to keep it a little bit better.
So tell me a little bit about your history, if you could, how you got into this. I mean, looking at your heavily redacted LinkedIn, you say you were a network security architect. So that could be kind of a lot of things. So talk about how that led you to this.
Yeah, in the 90s, I got a computer and just fell in love with the internet and have been in love ever since. So 30 years, whatever, of just loving computers. And I went to school for computers, got a bachelor's degree and computer engineering, and then couldn't get a job. And then finally got a certificate like many years later in Cisco, CCNA. And that landed me in a knock, which then got me exposed to a lot of stuff. I saw, millions of problems a day, and that took me into the security path. And so I became a Cisco CCSP, Cisco security professional. And it just kept getting certs in Cisco and Juniper and Fortinet and Palo Alto and Checkpoint, every cert that I could, just to get all the firewalls under my belt and security devices. And that was my thing, was network security engineer, and then architect eventually, and started to build a SOC at some point too, and monitoring the logs and alerts that were generated in there. And that's what I was doing for about 10 years before switching to this podcast.
And this podcast, this is full time now, right? You're you left the other career behind. That's awesome.
It completely. I mean, I was burnt out at work and said, okay, I just need to get out of here. And I had the podcast just starting up, and I had one Bitcoin. And it was kind of at the peak of Bitcoin. So I was able to sell that one Bitcoin for a pretty penny, which gave me like a 3-month runway to say, okay, I can quit my job and hang out for 3 months before going back to work. And that's what I focused on, the podcast during that time. And it was able to take off and show me, potential. Like, it was earning a few bucks, and I'm like, okay, I could just, like, next month they'll earn, a few bucks more. And I think I can get through this. So it was just barely enough to get me through it without having to go back to work. And this is a full-time job now.
So do you miss anything from working in terms of keeping your skills up to date, or are there things that you're doing now in addition to, the research you're doing and the stories you're creating to keep yourself up to date on all the latest things that are going on in the hacking world? Yeah.
It takes more effort, right? I have to get off my butt and actually go do stuff, as opposed to being at work. I'd just be thrown into the fire constantly. But I was the kind of guy that built a lab while I was working, right? So I've got a whole bunch of Cisco gear and some other gear in my lab in my garage. So, and that's in the production of my house. So I do get to get in that all the time and reroute traffic and open ports and stuff whenever I'm building cool things. But I do pull up some VMs and start doing stuff, but it's always just for fun and just out of curiosity to practice. And I do get rusty on it, that's for sure.
Now, I know you've interviewed a number of people that were actually involved in certain hacks and breaches, that you've talked to the hackers themselves, which is always really cool. What about on the side of like the companies that are getting attacked? Do you find that they're willing to communicate and share information with you, or do you have to kind of rely on the court documents or whatever for their information?
Yeah, that's a good question. The companies themselves have I have a harder time getting someone to talk about a breach that happened to them versus the hacker who actually did the breach. They seem to be more willing to talk about the illegal stuff they did versus the people who actually have the egg on their face, which is really interesting, right? And I think that was kind of another reason I wanted to start the show, is to share what it's like to be breached and talk about what were your first steps, what were the right things you did, what were the wrong things you did. And we don't talk about that enough from boots on the ground perspective. We talk about it from an expert level perspective, outside the bubble, saying this is what I think they did right and this is what I think they did wrong. Well, I think it's better to actually get from the people who were there. And I have a couple episodes where people have actually experienced something, and we walk through that. But that is something I do want to focus on more, is getting more companies themselves able to talk about the breach that they experienced, because I think there's a lot of value in talking about that.
So it seems like you still like to get your hands dirty, so to speak, with your lab in house and things. But 10 interviews and 10 episodes going at any one time, that's a lot of work. From your research and your perspective, are there things that as security professionals we're saying, hey, you should do X, Y, and Z, but you're finding from getting kind of deep in the weeds with these individuals that that's not actually right? Like, hey, you should always do, I don't know,
Change the admin password.
Yeah, change the admin password. And you're like, oh, well, actually, no, we found out a lot of times that doesn't work. Or is it just, we're doing the right things, we just don't do them very well?
Well, I think a lot. I mean, I'm not sure if something pops into my head right away on what I'm hearing as bad advice, but I think what we focus on maybe a little bit too much is some of the advice that is like if you want to have, you want to be good at something versus you want to be a pro athlete and you want to have that, half millisecond better, right? So there's a lot of progress you can make on basic things. And then there's a little progress you can make on, well, we should, do this one little, tip or something. So like the basic stuff is keeping your stuff up to date, right? If you could just always keep everything up to date, you're going to make hackers a lot, make their life a lot harder. And that's kind of the goal here, is to make it harder and harder for them. You're never going to make it completely impossible, but you want to make it so that they have to spend more energy, more time, more money, whatever it is, to get into your network, because then you may catch them or they just may give up. So, just the big wins, I think, are the things we need to be focusing on more. And the smaller things after that, it's just hard. It's hard when you're trying to secure your network to figure out what should I focus on first, and or the most important stuff. And so, a lot of security tips come out that, yeah, they're good advice, but it's just like small versus some of the other bigger things.
Well, I think this kind of ties into my question from earlier, that with a lot of companies, it's almost a catch-22, that they know that if they share how their breach occurred, that other people can learn from it and defend their networks better. But at the same time, I think a lot of them have a perceived liability. They feel like if they share, here's how we got breached, that it might make them look negligent. And so now they become, liable for those losses, or they lose their cyber insurance or something. So it's almost like the financial system or public relations or whatever has set them up to want to hide those details and not share with other people to help them secure better.
Well, would you take on a story if they said, hey, we'll go on this, but as long as you change all of our names, including our company name, and so we're not held liable like that?
Yeah, I've taken on a couple of those. In fact, there was a couple even where the person didn't want their voice on it. So we had to change the voice. And the best way to do that is to just get voice actors to read the script, or, reread the interview notes. And yeah, we've gone through that if that's what's needed. So yeah, I'm definitely up for hiding the people who don't want to be hidden.
Sure. So I mentioned to a couple of people in the office that we were doing this interview this week, and found out a couple of ladies here that have a crush on you. I didn't ask any of the guys, but one of them might not be Don's wife. But my question is, what kind of feedback have you heard from other people that that are listening? If people found that it's helped them, or are people reaching out to you now with story ideas?
Oh, it's just incredible. I'm just so blown away. And to make something, artistic like, or creative like, and to have people just appreciate it, it gives me a high that's just so pure and clean that can just drive me to the moon. It's so amazing. But, some of the things I've done is reached kind of the younger audience, like the teenagers, who may not know, because they're in circles where everyone's doing this, right? And they don't know it's wrong or bad, or what kind of trouble they can get into, or that they can even do this thing, get paid doing it. That's the thing that kind of blows their mind. So like, well, I thought this was just for fun. I can actually go get a job, like pen testing, well, sign me up. Why am I screwing around doing this for free, right? So, I reach some of the younger audience, and then they get inspired to actually go do this as a career. And I think that's some of the most amazing things that I've heard from people. And just other people have told me that they've switched careers to security, and other people who aren't even close to security, like they're painters or mechanics or something, just are completely absorbed into it because I mean, this is the topic of everyone's mind, right? You go get your haircut, and the barber's talking about hacks and stuff. Like, everyone knows about this and is interested and curious. So I try to make it reachable to everyone. At the same time, I want it to be, still informative for people like us who are in the InfoSec space and understand all this stuff.
So, it just coincidence, I guess, but my barber, this is a true story, legitimately asked me, like, Don, if you know how to do this, why don't we write ransomware and just move to Russia? And my answer was, I don't like being a criminal. And I thought it was an odd question to ask, but you are absolutely right that, your barber, everybody hears about this, and there's a lot of fear and uncertainty around it. So, thank you for creating your resource to help people learn a little more about the reality of what's going on out there and what can be done.
Yeah, and I think I was sort of inspired by a talk that I think it was Leslie Carhart and Johnny Christmas did, and they said, don't try to be, I mean, you can try to be a rock star in the InfoSec space, but it's really hard, right? There's a lot of rock stars here. Try to be a rock star, not in the info space, but about InfoSec. So like, go to Comic-Con and tell them you're a pen tester and watch all their jaws drop, and they're be amazed at you that you can, talk about hacking in such detail on stage. Like, that is an interesting way to reach out, beyond our bubble and get to things. And that was very inspirational to me. And I'm like, well, how can I reach to people? And I thought a podcast might do that. And I think it has. So I think it's interesting to get outside our bubble as well and see what kind of impact we can make there.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that because I hear Don and Justin talk about these things in detail of what's happening each week, but I'm not in a position where I could get in and understand the code or things. But listening to episodes of your show, I'm able to actually understand it. So it's not just for hackers or people in the industry to listen to, but at the same time, people in the industry would certainly appreciate the insight and understanding that you're providing there. So for those that are at home and want to listen that have not before, what's the best way to find you?
Well, the easiest thing is to go to darknetdiaries.com. You can listen to the show right on there, or find it in your podcast player, Darknet Diaries. And I'm most active on Twitter, which my name there is Jack Rhysider on Twitter.
Yep, and that's spelled Rhysider. So definitely check them out there. But Jack, thank you so much for taking the time with us today.
Well, this has been super fun. Thanks, guys.
And hopefully we're never featured on an episode of Darknet Diaries.
Yeah, I kind of want that. Like, every business should have in the back of their head, let's not get on Darknet Diaries.
Yeah. Oh, we've made it. Yeah, that's how you know you've made it. Well, thank you, Jack, for taking the time today, and thank all of you for watching. But stay tuned. We've got more Technado coming up right after this.